And I have had the pleasure of knowing him for a couple years, and he has one of the most extensive libraries I would love to have that he's shown. And please welcome Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. I'm glad to be back here again. So this is me warming up for hopefully a new series of presentations, because I have not spoken in over 4 years, so haven't been invited, so I appreciate you all inviting me to come and speak. So today we'll talk about United States military records. This is actually one of my earliest presentations that I've done, so one of my favorite topics. I'm going to ask that try to limit questions. I mean, if I'm not being clear on something, please don't hesitate to ask. So what I'll be talking about here, of course, is United States military records. When I first created this presentation, this was at a time that people, of course, it was actually pre-digital, and people were reluctant to get involved in military records. Usually they felt like if they had military ancestry, they would already know, and more often than not, they didn't feel like they did, so they didn't bother researching. So I want to really show here why military records can be a great genealogical resource. It's actually rich in information and stories and family connections. So my response was always when people were like, I don't have a military ancestor, and I'm like, well, how do you know? Have you actually searched military records? Did you do your collateral lines? Because it's not just about your direct ancestor, but the family. It's a family, it's a family part of history. It's not just an individual part of history. The whole family is involved in what's ever going on when you have even just one member of the family in the military. And most people are thinking, well, I already know everything I know of my recent generations of family, and we have no military history. We're not a military family, so I don't think I have military history, but you might. And so what I'm going to show, again, like I said, wealth of information. The possibility is certainly out there. And today, now, more and more military records have been digitized, and not just simply on Fold 3, but also, Family Search. If it exists on microfilm, they have it there. So there's a lot of more resources and information now available to you. So it's certainly worth the time and effort to get involved. And one of the other things is, of course, with military history, I'm hoping to show you the impact on history, but the impact on your family, the impact on genealogy, again, the valuable wealth of records that are created and available. And it is significant as a resource. You can literally get buried in the information. Because there's a lot of individual data, there's a lot of family data, and then of course there's the information, the story, the history of your ancestor or the family involved in the wartime experience or the peacetime experience and so on. And of course, most importantly, clues for further research. So I'm going to provide basically a broad overview of military records, this is going to be a lot of detail on how the records were initially created, because records weren't originally, they were created, but they weren't organized for sure. And so the records that I'm talking about is the government records and how they've been organized. I'm also going to throw out some definitions and terminology so that you know what to look for, what to ask for in the right terms. Basically, like I said, enough for you to understand, to know what more you can do or what you need to do. I can't give you all my secrets, but there's a lot out there, and I just want to be able to tip the iceberg here for you to give you an idea of what you can look for and what's out there. So, and then, like I said, also I'll even do an overview of the many wars, the time periods, the time frames, the locations of records, whether at the state or federal level and provide clues like analytical ideas for how to proceed with your research. So war, an unfortunate part of the human condition, happens for many varied reasons, whether it's for the resources, for the land, for over religion and various other things. But the one interesting thing, it's usually an event that occurs between nations. And I want you to think about that, because basically that makes, war a bureaucracy. And in genealogy, as much as we may hate it in our personal lives, in genealogy we love bureaucracy because we're seeking those records out. But unfortunately, war does destroy records. This is the courthouse. It was just completed in 1855, and less than 10 years later, Sherman got his hands on it. And it's a tough county to do research in, Washington County, Georgia. So you can see the disadvantage, of course. We look at war and military as, a hardship on our genealogy from a, Burnt County standpoint. But like I said, war is between nations. Nations create bureaucracy, create records, and so there are a lot of records out there for military research. But like I said, here's the destruction. Most of America's early wars, of course, were always within the boundaries of our country, including, for example, the War of 1812, where the British captured Washington, D.C. and burnt the city, and so many records were destroyed. The Civil War, of course, was very destructive, particularly for Virginia, Georgia, and so on. So a lot of early records are lost. But it also creates records. A lot of records, unique, different kinds of records have been created. Military records can find many missing ancestors, usually that you can't find them in other types of records. And especially because you have a qualifying age range, anywhere from 16 to 60, you can find an ancestor or a collateral ancestor on a family tree who may have been in one of our the service of the country. And this is a chart I just recently found. It's really nice. It helps you to give you an idea of when somebody would have been born, as early as they could have been born and as late as they could have been born, to have participated in a particular war. So remember that this, I think it's the presentation. Will the presentation be online? So yeah, you'll be able to see that chart, because I know that one's not in the handout. So like I said, military records provide a great wealth of individual data, family data, proof of relationships, the wartime life and experience, both of the ancestor and the family, and clues for further direction for research. Pros and cons of military records. Ancestor need not have necessarily actually served to be mentioned in certain aspects of military records. For example, obviously, the widow didn't always serve, but they're mentioned in military records. The father may not have served, things like that. There's no guarantee of a fine, obviously. It's just like any other aspect of genealogy. Maybe you'll find a little. Maybe some of you might hit the jackpot. I've heard stories of people finding out 2 widows coming out of the woodwork to claim the same pension, for example. I actually have a kinsman. He was trying to file for a false pension based on indicating he was a soldier in the war with Mexico. And let me tell you, that's the records were this thick because they caught him, trying to defraud the government. So most records are pretty easily available now, like I said, particularly digitized, but sometimes there's still going to be records that are difficult to acquire. And they can provide a great wealth of information. So frequency of America's wars. New World settlers came to America, to the colonies, to the New World to escape the wars happening in Europe, but really they found that the war only followed them, because these nations started. We talk about World War I, but World War I was actually, some would say the French and Indian War was World War I. That was one of the first intercontinental wars between Europe and France that literally went around the world. So that's what was going on with the French and Indian War. So here in the colonies, we're having the same, it was called a different war, but it was the same series of wars between the same two nations. And then, of course, there was the conflict with the natives who were trying to keep the white man at bay. Settlers had to find these wars themselves. They weren't trained as soldiers, but they had to find ways to fight. So you have your farmers, your carpenters, your masons, etc., going off to war, even though they weren't trained as soldiers. Basically, what I've calculated basically is that America was at war every 15 to 20 years, pretty regular, like the census, So from the colonial period to the present. So there's definitely going to be a lot of records created. This is just a list, I think it's in your handout, but I can't remember, of just all the different wars that we've been involved in, over time. Most of them, of course, colonial wars, and then after we became a country, began with the Revolution, War of 1812, and so on, more Indian wars, Spanish-American War, and so on. So it is a lot of wars, a lot of potential military records out there. There's a time frame where military records are considered to be the primary high potential resource for finding lost ancestors. The period from 1775 to 1875 is considered the century of missing ancestors. Usually this is the hardest time in your research. During this time, this is where you find most of your gaps. And military records have been known to be the type of records that can help fill those gaps. So military records. So basically, I categorize military records 3 categories, 2 primary categories, and a 3rd miscellaneous category. The first category, service records. These are the records that are created at the time that your ancestor was actually in the service. So these are definitely going to be primary resources, primary genealogy resources. This is the enlistment papers, the muster rolls, the pay vouchers, hospital records, and so on. Now, just to understand, prior to World War I, there was no such thing as an individual file of your service. There wasn't a file that followed you around. And so it was kind of like you have to do genealogy just to find your ancestor in the military records. In other words, you might find them in a muster book over here at one location, and then pay voucher over here by the quartermaster, and then the hospital has their own records of you being there, and so on. And so the records were created either by a certain department, by a particular unit, or by a different facility, and for various specified reasons. So in other words, it's like I said, the records similar to, like, you look over here for census, and you look over there for land, and you look over there for vital documents. That's how military records originally were kept prior to World War I. So the records were always scattered around. Well, this quickly, the government began to actually get smart and realized that when they were offering pensions to all these veterans, they had to be able to prove or disprove whether a veteran did qualify for the pension or not. So the War Department actually hired people during the latter part of the 19th century to actually go through all these books, of pay vouchers, unit enlistments, hospital records, prisoner of war records, and so on, and pull the names out of all these different records, put them onto cards, file all the cards together, and basically created an individual service record. This is how they were able to prove if somebody was filing for a falsely filing for a pension, or so on. And they did this only primarily for volunteers and for all the old wars, creating these individual files. So that's the project. They're extracting this information. Basically, they're doing what genealogists are doing today. We looking at the census record, we pull the information out and create a file of that ancestor, of the different censuses and so on. And eventually matching these cards and grouping them together, they created these, it's called the Compiled Service Records Jacket Envelopes. And again, mostly for volunteer soldiers only in the major wars. This did not include regular standing military, someone in the Navy or the Marines or professional soldiers in the Army. So I'm going to give you some examples of what these service records look like. Remember, service records are the records created at the time of being in the service. So for example, this is my ancestor, William Alexander Milam, who was a soldier in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. And you get an idea. You see that these are actually 3 different cards. And you'll see the person, the very bottom of the card is the signature of the person who extracted the record. And you'll see, so for example, the first one, he extracted the record from the company muster and roll. And so on that date, when the company was mustered in, all the soldiers, there was a muster book listing all the different names in maybe chronological order or whatever. And so that's what the first one is. The second one is when they did a muster roll call, and he was absent because he had been wounded at the Battle of Manassas, and so on. So these are these individual file cards. So this is what I mean by this is the information was extracted from the original source. So if you question some of this, you can still go to at least this tells you where to go to look at the original source. Because a good example is, this is the service record. This is, if you look at the name, like you've got W.H. Milam, W.H. Milliam, William H. Milliam, you know, so it's Milam. So obviously this person who is pulling these names were extracting it incorrectly. But they were able to combine it correctly with the card because he was in the Company H of the 60th Georgia Regiment. Here's another example. This is a great uncle of mine, Thomas M. Wilbanks, serving in the Confederate. And here it actually identifies his father as James Wilbanks. So an example where the source is giving family data. This is an interesting one, William H. Milam. This is a distant cousin. But notice how it gives his physical description. He's 17 years of age. He's 5'8" tall, fair complexion, black eyes, black hair. He was born in Preble County, Ohio. So a lot of real good personal detail from this service record. This is why I like to encourage service records, because if the ancestor didn't live long enough to get a pension, then without the service record you really are going to have nothing. At least you'll have this much if you can get the service record as well. Now this is a distant ancestor, M.B. Milam, and he was killed in action, and so you see the different kinds of pieces of information. What was interesting, you see that last card where it referenced another service record, W.L. Milam. So I did what I was told, and I went and looked for the service record of W.L. Milam. And but first of all, this is what from his service record, this is all the information I gathered just from his service record. See how much detail is there? It even identified who his father was. And I hadn't even yet gotten to the service record for W.L. Milam. But I went and found the service record for W.L. Milam, and this was in there. And it talks about Henry Milam, the father of M.B. and W.L., filing for missing back pay for his 2 sons that were killed in action. Yeah. So that expanded out, and this is the information I got for William L. Milam. So you can see how much data you can get. Obviously, these two, they were not married. They both died during the war, so there's not going to be a pension by him or a widow. So that's where the service records, in this instance, was very, very handy. So like I said, with service records, there is no record of this nature, no compilations of individual service records for regular Navy, regular Marines, regular Army. And so a special search would have to be required. But like I said, more and more of all these records are being digitized, they're being put online, family search, fold 3, and so on. So you might find something there. There's no comprehensive index for all soldiers in all wars since the beginning of the United States. You have to learn about indexes for each major war, and I'll get into that shortly. Now, the second category of military records is benefits records. These are the pensions and the bounty land. These are the records that are created many years after the actual service. So while on the one hand it could still be considered a primary source, since it's also partly based on memory or transfer of information. In other words, maybe the veteran himself didn't apply for a pension, but the widow did, but the widow wasn't actually the one in service. So you can see where you have to be careful. But again, these is a great wealth of information, these resources. And bounty land was the other. Up until 1855, the U.S. government was giving land away to veterans for their service. So with benefit records, particularly with pensions, there's three types of pensions. There's disability, a veteran's pension, and widows and orphans pensions. These are often the most sought after. I mean, even most genealogists know the wealth of information you can get from these, but we saw that that's only if a pension was actually filed. The richest in information, the details of the veteran or the family before service, during service, and after service. So I'm going to give a couple examples of pensions for Nicholas Gostwick and John Wilbanks from the War of 1812. So Nicholas Gostwick was the older brother of my ancestor, Aberilla Gostwick, who married William Wilbanks, who served in the Revolutionary War. Nicholas also served from Union County, and so he filed for a pension. And it basically shows, he served from North Carolina. He was born, it gave the date and where he was born. And when they were small, they moved to North Carolina from Maryland. There was a 38-page pension file, which is pretty good. But what was really interesting was that he tore the pages out of his father's psalm book, which listed the birth dates of all the children of him and his siblings. This is the pages as it came out on the microfilm. And the reason this was advantageous for me is because obviously I'm not descended from Nicholas or Sophina or Joseph, but I am descended from Aberilla. There's her birth date, the first one on side B. So I got her exact birth date. And plus, this also connected me. This was a jackpot find for me when I was up in Salt Lake City, because ancestors kinsmen of mine had been researching the family, Aberilla, as a Gosset, not a Gostwick. And when I found Nicholas Gostwick as in Aberilla's pension, I thought, oh, well, maybe it's Gostwick, not Gosset. And sure enough, I found Nicholas's pension, and that's what connected me. I went back 4 more generations that day. So it was a huge, huge find. So that's why you don't just limit your research to your direct ancestor. Collateral ancestors can be a wealth of information. This is John Wilbanks, one of Aberilla's sons, not my ancestor. But he applied for a pension and bounty land. And then she followed up with a pension herself. And so this is some of the information we got from her pension, filing as a widow of a War of 1812 veteran. And this is just highlights of the information I got from the pension. All of this is directly out of the pension file. You see how much wealth. She even identifies his first wife, for example, and when she died, and then when she married him, and who married them, and so on. And these are all the people that were acquainted with both of them. This was also, all these people were mentioned in the pension file. Neighbors and friends. So a wealth of information just from that pension file as well. So then bounty land is the second form of benefit records. Again, like I said, the United States was rich, wealthy in land, poor in money, so it was easier you give people land and then you tax them on it. So that was the best way to get money. So they would disperse this public domain land to veterans, but this process was discontinued after 1855. So here's where John Wilbanks from the War of 1812 applied for bounty land. Now what is very common is, for example, he lives down in South Carolina. He has no interest in Michigan, because I think that's where this is. Michigan Territory is where he's getting this land. But he ended up selling so he obtained the bounty and then sold it to, investors, land speculators. So, and he got his money and they got the land that they wanted. So, now for other category of types of military records is miscellaneous records. I mean, it really is just a catch-all because it could just about be anything. Soldiers' homes records, wealth of information on both Fold 3 and Family Search are burial and headstone applications for people getting applications for headstones for veterans. And then there's other types of complex or varied kinds of military records that would fall in the miscellaneous category. Here's a headstone application, for example. Some other examples, civilian contractors. So again, your ancestor need not actually have served. They could have been involved somehow with the military as a civilian contractor. Family members of soldiers. Just today I was looking at, there's a file, digitized records of burials on all military posts from like 1850 to 1947. And most people would assume it's a veteran, but not always the case. Civilians were buried on these posts. Children of officers were buried on these posts. So it's quite an interesting array of records to look at. Military arrests, draft registration, fiscal records from the Revolutionary War, aliens during the War of 1812. Of course, the Japanese-American internment was military process procedure, therefore they're military records. And then this is the World War I draft registration for my great-grandfather's younger half-brother, Pink Burroughs Wilbanks. And this is his draft registration card. It's not actually, if you think about it, it's not actually a military because he's not in the military, but it's military related. So let's go on to any questions about military records. You kind of get the idea what kind of records I'm talking about. Yep. So now American military history. Yes. The what? Oh, the bounty land. Well, it's an application process. They would find a lawyer, let's say they lived in, Georgia and they wanted to get bounty land. They would find a lawyer and they would engage with somebody up in Washington, D.C., and they would apply on their behalf, probably with the War Department, on obtaining this bounty land for the veteran. So it is like a legal procedure, yeah. Any other questions on types of records? Yes?
I found a lot of good information on draft registration for World War I. My family's mainly immigrants, but I have some gaps. And so, I have questions about why some people were registered, which produced information for me, like a niece that I never knew about was listed on a draft registration record by her father who never served because he had kids. But then I said, gee, what about all these other people? I have my aunt's husband came from Italy and he served in World War I, but I never found his draft registration. I have another distant cousin who should have had a draft registration, but he ended up in California. So the question, was he fleeing registration and that's why he went to California from New York?
No, I wouldn't say that would be the case. I mean, every male, World War I think had one draft. I know during World War II they had two because they had a younger men's draft and then they had an older men's draft. But everyone had to register. So it could be maybe you're not finding the record because maybe he wasn't where you thought he was, because it is based on where he was at the time of the registering of the draft. Remember that the card is a registration, not an actual draft. So where was he when he registered? That's one thing. How was his name spelt or misspelt? You know, that would be another thing. But also he could have been missed, like you know, because we know that people are missed in the census. You know that should be there, but somehow, you know, and you find out, oh, the census taker missed a whole road, you know. So it's hard to know for sure what's going on.
I was going to say my husband's grandfather did not register because he worked for a company that was supporting the war. So that whole group did not register because they already supporting the war. So that's why we went on him.
I find that surprising because, I mean, even though, because the idea of the draft to register is to find out who qualifies, well, who's of age. But then, yes, you could still be excused for various reasons. But, I mean, I suppose they could have just said, well, this whole company doesn't have to register. I suppose that's possible. So, yes? I'm not aware of that. This is where I was talking about civilian contract records related to the military, or, you know, maybe initially they weren't connected to the military, but then when we went to war, then all of a sudden these companies are now military important. So it's hard to know. That's a whole, like, I can see this as a whole different turn in a genealogical record resource that you know. And business records are becoming more and more of a unique and different kind of genealogy resource, providing that the company kept those records, put them in a manuscript collection in some library, you know, who knows. That's a whole different, animal. All right, so let's move on to American military history. Basically, we can divide America's military history into these 6 categories. You know, the colonial period, just the Revolutionary War alone is a category. The post-Revolutionary War period, that's the period between the Revolution and the Civil War, the period after the Civil War, and then the 20th century. So I'll get into more about these. So for the colonial period, so we talked about, you know, all these people coming to the New World and realizing that they need to be armed and to protect themselves, because soldiers generally, or the army generally, did not come to the New World. You know, and so what they had to do is, in the New World, in these new colonies, create what they called militias. Usually, this is where the term hundred comes from, in Virginia particularly. Hundred was an area of land where you could get 100 men together to fight as a company, and which was usually led by a captain. So these were men who would be called out for emergencies. You know, maybe the Native Americans were coming in and attacking, or the country was going to war. And until the British could bring soldiers over in the French and Indian War, British soldiers weren't generally part of the colonial landscape. So the local people became the soldiers. So you have the militia. And then, again, you'd have anyone who could carry a gun, had a horse, and was between the ages of 16 and 60. One weekend a month, they'd go drilling on the town's green, which usually turned into a big social gathering. Nice way of saying, you know, party. And like I said, about 100 men would be commanded by a captain. And these records, so because they're colonial period records, the United States didn't exist yet, so therefore the federal government's not going to have these records. These records are going to be at the state level, at the colony. So these colonial period, you'll have service records on occasion, if they still exist, if the state archives has them. Again, a great substitute when there's no census, of course, prior to the United States. Maybe there's tax lists, or maybe the tax lists are missing. Again, service records is another way of finding out about people who lived in an area. And then occasionally these colony states did give out benefits after service, including bounty land. State archives would have these records. Nothing, again, like I said, at the National Archives. Many of these records have been published in a variety of books, periodicals, and so on. Refer to that list of major wars to get an idea of what kind of activity, military activity, was going on in your particular colony of your ancestor. The Revolutionary War, a lot of people aren't aware of the unpopularity of the war, you might say. Only about a third of colonists were for the war, a third were loyal to England, and a third just got up and moved away if they could. But the initial foundation of the American military force was the militia. So the militia would be called out from the various counties, and you'd form regiments. And then a Continental Army was eventually formulated of military regulars, your professional soldiers, formed in 1775, 1776 by the Continental Congress. So these are two different kinds of records that you're going to be looking for. Records of the militia from the colonies, records of the Continental military from the government, the Continental Congress. And then also, if your ancestor might have been a loyalist, maybe was a mercenary from Germany that escaped later, these records are going to be in England, maybe even in Germany, depending. So that's a whole different area. I wouldn't even begin to know where to begin. After the Revolutionary War, well, the Revolutionary War itself was a period of transition naturally. We're transitioning from a colonial government to a federal government. So the compiled service records may or may not be complete, but they're definitely indexed, available at the National Archives. Benefit records, of course, are going to be the valuable genealogical resource. Different periods of benefits, early pensions. Very early pensions required congressional approval. So sometimes your ancestor's pension for the Revolutionary War service might actually be in Congress, state papers, things like that. As far as, and here's that availability. The state archives might have records. The federal government, these will be the earliest records at the National Archives. In the War of 1812, I mentioned, capital was burnt, so a lot of early Revolutionary War records and early census records were lost. A little-known resource is the final payment voucher for those who were receiving a pension. In other words, a family member, would say, "Oh, my father or my widowed mother passed away, and we need one last final payment." And there's a special listing of these final payments for service. After the Revolutionary War, now we're developing a new government. We're growing as a nation, and military is now primarily a federal government matter. So the records are starting to become more uniform, more reliable. Most likely you'll find the records at the National Archives, but that's not to eliminate the state archives as still a potential resource. Overall, the United States was really opposed to a large standing military. At the beginning of the Civil War, there were less than 3,000 soldiers in the American military. That's why throughout our history, most of our military was based on volunteer service. So that's why anybody's ancestor could have served in the military, whether they're a farmer, carpenter, or so on. So we have to think in those terms. And so, like I said, America was usually not prepared for war. That's why it would actually, we'd declare war and it'd be 6 months before there was the first battle because they're still trying to get troops together. You had to call up the local militia to create the military, these citizen soldiers. So for this period between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, you have these compiled service records and indexes in these 4 separate categories. Remember, I said there is not one comprehensive index for all soldiers in all wars. They are broken down by these different periods. Revolutionary War, service from 1784 to 1811, the War of 1812, the Indian Wars, and the Mexican War. These are independent individual indexes and service records. They're compiled based on that time of service. And in the benefit records, the pensions, again, these are a separate series of indexes and pensions filed separately. There's a period of what's called the Old Wars. So you see the service may have been from 1783 to 1861, but the pensions were given anytime between 1815 and 1926. War of 1812, a pension wasn't given until 1871 at the earliest. And this is what I was talking about. And then all of a sudden the government realized, oh, we have to prove that they did or didn't serve. And they started compiling these service records. The Mexican War was by the pensions were from the Pensions Act of 1887, and then Indian Wars. And remember what I said about bounty land, numerous congressional acts, but the last act in 1855 basically ended bounty land being offered. The War of 1812, the pensions and bounty land are consolidated into one file. And by the way, I know that they're still working on, if I recall, digitizing all these records eventually. They're still working on it as far as I know. And then we get on to the Civil War, truly an all-American war, you might say, where we have the North versus the South. Confederate records were purposefully not destroyed. It's common that either the losing side will destroy all their military records and other types of government records, but instead Jefferson Davis specifically made sure nothing got destroyed and willingly turned over all records and information to the Union armies and the federal government. Therefore, those records, even though it's from a different country, if you think about it, they're filed, all the Confederate records are filed with the state of National Archives as captured records of war. So many Confederate records you'll find at the National Archives. Service records, Union and Confederate, are at the National Archives. They're indexed on microfilm. But there is a website now where you can search the index for any and all Civil War service. It was created by the National Parks Service. I believe this was a project during the late 90s, early 2000s. Many genealogists across the country helped to create this index database. There are possible additional service records at various state archives. Because one of the concepts, if you think about it, the Confederate concept was that they didn't want to be involved, that didn't want the federal government to get involved in their state business. So even though it was kind of a contradiction in terms when they had to turn over their regimental units from their state to the Confederate Army or the Confederate government. So states like Georgia were still adamant about keeping certain units in their own state, and so those records never made it to the Confederate government. So you'll still want to, and this is the same in the case in the North as well, Michigan or Wisconsin. Sometimes your state archives will still have a wealth of Civil War related types of military records. As far as benefits records, pensions, the federal government, of course, offered pensions to anyone who served in the Union Army. And those records are at the National Archives. The pensions are interfiled from a period starting with the Civil War up through World War I. There's a significant index on microfilm. And when I talk about these indexes being on microfilm, that means they're actually on Family Search as a digitized record, microfilm that you can look at. As far as the Confederate benefit records, the Confederate pensions, naturally, the United States government is not going to offer a Confederate soldier a pension. So that was offered by the former Confederate states. So you have to know where your ancestor was living at the time that he would have been of an age as a Confederate soldier to get a pension. Here's the catch, for example. For example, my ancestor, William Alexander Milam, he was born in South Carolina. He served in Georgia, But after the war, he moved to Alabama. Where do you think he got his pension? Alabama. He didn't get it from Georgia, and he didn't get it from South Carolina. I've been part of a series of research on veterans, Confederate veterans particularly, that came out to Arizona. Arizona was founded as a Confederate territory initially, but it did not offer Confederate pensions. Therefore, if your ancestor left the South, went to Arizona, or even went to Indiana or Michigan, then they were out of luck. They weren't going to get a Confederate pension. Your ancestor, if your ancestor was a Confederate, they had to have lived in a former Confederate state and then applied for a pension, them or their widow. So just to clarify that. So here's a pension index card for a veteran. You can see that the widow applied for the pension for her husband, and there's a unit he served in, and there's when she filed. I guess he must have been killed in action, so she filed that year. After the Civil War, of course, now we're dealing with a variety of things going on. The Reconstruction of the South, the Indian Wars on the Western frontier, the labor disputes in the late 19th century. Mostly now we're not dealing with volunteer forces. This is mostly regular Army, regular Navy, regular Marines. So there's a whole different aspect to trying to do genealogy with military records. Like I said, though, most of these are now starting to turn up on sites like Fold3, Family Search. So you can investigate, learn more. If you think your ancestor was in the regular military during this time frame, like I said, you can start doing that kind of research, find out what's available. The 20th century is, of course, a new time, particularly in American history as well as in American military history. We are starting to engage in the possibility of becoming on the world scene. And meanwhile, the military, having learned from trying to provide pensions to veterans of the older wars and realizing you can't keep records all over the place, you need to have a file for each individual service person. By the World War I, they're starting to keep individual service file records. We talk about the 20th century, and like I said, since we're talking, what we're really talking about is, like I said, the United States coming onto the world scene. And the first place we started to do that was the Spanish-American War, 1898. So I like to think that the 20th century begins in 1898 from a historical standpoint when we're talking about military records. And shortly after that, there was the Philippine insurrection, and then the Boxer Rebellion in China. And then, of course, we have World Wars I and II, Korea, Vietnam, and so on. Most records, I think World War I records are starting to transition to the National Archives in, well, I think they're now putting all the military records in Georgia, in the Atlanta archives. But they're becoming available, in other words, they're getting them out of the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. The National Personnel Records Center is the more modern keeper of the still relevant records. So service for World Wars I and II were originally kept there, Korea, Vietnam, and so on. But I think the records of World Wars I and II are starting to be transitioned, but it's a slow process. Many records, the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, of course, had a fire, so we often talk about the records that were lost, but they're finding more and more records. Not as many records were lost as they thought. So, and that's still an ongoing process to recover those records. And that was in 1973, I think, when the fire was. So it's an ongoing thing. So quickly, some aspects of research facilities. Well, of course, the National Archives has a lot of our federal military records. Both records and services are extensive and thorough. In the old school time, you know, you'd order a form, they'd send you a bunch of forms, you fill out the 4-part form, send it in, you know, and get the records that way. But now you can order them through the website. You can create a profile or create an account on the National Archives website. And it's not just limited to military records. Now you can order pages from the census records or other types of records and so on. This is that form I was talking about that we used to get, form NATF form 85. And you can still get this. You can if you don't want to do the ordering online and pay for it online, you can still do it this way. But otherwise, you can create, an account, create a profile on the National Archives site, and you can order online. So the National Archives, like I mentioned, is not going to have colonial records, but they do have indexes, service records, and benefit records based on these wars, except for Confederate, of course. They have records for the regular Army, Naval, and Marine records, records regarding civilians, and so on. The National Personnel Records Center, which is a branch of the National Archives system, which is in St. Louis, has mostly records since 1912, but like I said, World War I, they may now finally be transitioning some of those records over. Some of the World War II records I'm starting to see on Fold 3 and Family Search, but these are not the individual service records. These are the reports or lists and things like that. The draft records I know are at the branch in Atlanta for World War I. Meanwhile, don't forget your state archives, where you might find in the older states colonial military service records or militia military service records, some Union and Confederate service records, some National Guard records, possibly some benefit records from that state for their veterans, and of course the Confederate records. But like I said, if the federal government put it on microfilm, Salt Lake City has it, which means it's on Family Search, because I believe they've now completed their process of digitizing all their microfilm, as far as I know, and therefore not necessarily all indexed, but it's there on Family Search, and you should be able to get access to this. And it should be open access because it's federal government records, so they can't lock it out. All these indexes are, if they're on microfilm, service and pensions for all wars are on Family Search. Confederate service records are supposed to be on Family Search or on microfilm, but not necessarily pensions, but maybe. Sometimes I can't keep up with it. Revolutionary War pensions are on microfilm, so you should be able to get them online. Fold 3, I think, has them, as well as Family Search. Now, I often like to encourage, going to the library. And I don't mean just a genealogy library. People don't think about just researching regular libraries, that the resources they might have. So this is an example. College and university libraries utilize what's called the Library of Congress classification system. And just for an example, here's where you would find United States history is E178. The Civil War is particularly E456 and so on. You see how I have it broken down by Civil War unit histories. And this would apply across the board. Anything United States military history. You'd be surprised. You can go to, I've gone to the ASU Hayden Library and found all kinds of books. A list, just all kinds of books. For example, the Tennessee Questionnaire. In 1920, Tennessee submitted questionnaires to every Union and Confederate veteran living within the state of Tennessee and asked them all kinds of questions about their experience in the Civil War. It was published in 5 volumes, and ASU has that, for example. It's not something you might find in any other library. So that's an example why I encourage just going to a library. I worked at the Scottsdale Public Library, so here's the Dewey Decimal System, is the classification system they use. I found a book that listed all the soldiers that surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse at the end of the Civil War. Right there on the reference shelf in the Scottsdale Public Library. That's what I mean. You just don't know what you're going to find. And this is just like I said, I'm just talking about looking for genealogy type resources. Not to mention, of course, you should learn about these wars or learn about these units, these the ship that your ancestors served on and so on. And you can do that as well. So some other aspects of research tips, of course, the strategy is where was your ancestor living at the time that the war broke out? Usually the best source is going to be, of the first possible best source is going to be the census. So in other words, where was your ancestor living in 1810, and was he still there when the 1812 war broke out? That's likely where he's going to have served from. That's where he's going to have enlisted from. County histories have all, old county histories, new county histories, always have a military history chapter. History of veterans, history of units that came out of that county that went off to fight. Those that were killed in action, things like that. But also think in terms of where was your ancestor living across the state line or across the county line. Well, if your ancestor lived, it's literally possible he could live in one county but literally be closer to the county seat of the next county over. And a young man is going to be in a hurry to enlist, doesn't want to miss out on the war, so they might run the opposite direction to go enlist, in the next county over, which also could be the next state over, if it's a county, on the state line. So you have to take that into account as well. But learn, where was your ancestor living? What units were created from that county? Because if you have a William Smith or a John Smith, heaven forbid, that you are trying to find out about their military service, you could have 25, 30, 100 John Smiths from Michigan. You need to find the one that was served in a unit from the county where your ancestor was living. So you have to get to know all the units that came out of that county during that time. Family sources, diaries, of course, journals, letters, photos. People to this day are still finding stuff up in the attic or in the basement of their ancestors' Civil War service and publishing new books. We're always getting new resources in history and information out. Obituaries, cemeteries, and headstones. Just so you know, Confederate headstones have a point at the top so that no Yankee will sit on their tombstone. So that's the kind of thing that, little stories you need to know. Obviously if your ancestor named a child, did he name him after a Confederate general or a Union general? That should give you some hint as to which side to look for, Local histories, locality histories will have some good information, of course. Published military records, more and more, of course, showing up online. You have organizations creating websites of unit histories and lists of soldiers and so on. Other clues to military records, the 1840 list of Revolutionary War pensioners, the 1890 lists of Union veterans and widows. That's one of the few parts of the 1890 census that actually survived. And little secret, sometimes you'll find Confederate pensioners listed in there. So it's supposed to be Union, but some census takers didn't care. County records, of course, you've got your militia activities, officer appointments, and so on. Veterans and lineage organizations, either those at the time that your ancestor was a veteran and joined, like the United Confederate Veterans or Grand Army of the Republic. The Confederate Veteran Magazine was published from 1896 to 1932. Every issue is at Hayden Library and ASU in the basement. And I've found great obituaries and stories by veterans of their experience in the Civil War. Of course, current veterans groups are also resources. Lineage societies, Sons of Confederate Veterans, Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, Sons of the War of 1812, Daughters of the American Revolution, so on. They're keeping lots of good information, good records, good databases, so on. And then, like I said, research the unit histories. I have a copy of the book published by someone who served in the same brigade, not in the same regiment as my ancestor during the Civil War, but the same brigade. And so when I follow along, because the brigade was formed in Georgia, got on the train and went to serve under Stonewall Jackson. And so it was a lot of great stuff that this soldier provided in his experience. So great histories of that unit and other units. Reenactors are their authenticity is so important to them. They will certainly know more than you do about your own ancestor, even though they're not remotely related. Things like that. So, and again, lots of websites, lots of great resources out there. So, like I said, briefly, get to know a little bit about the history of the war from the national level, the local level. I'm doing research for a client. His ancestor was too old to serve in World War I and II, but he was a dentist, so he served. He helped with recruitment for the state of Wisconsin during both those wars, and he's got accolades from the governor and so on. So, and then there's Google. Yeah, I know Wikipedia. What if there's nothing else out there, sometimes it tells you at least what you don't know, and then you can follow up and get more research. But they identify resources, citations, and so on. So just get you'd be surprised what you might find out there. Research the history of the unit, tells you what battle they participated, who the leaders were. A lot of people don't realize these units up through the Civil War. Think about the militia units. 100 men within a certain radius would form a company. Well, if you think about it, almost all of them are family. They're all interconnected one way or another. Cousins, brothers. The doctor is the doctor that probably gave birth to half the men in the unit. The minister is probably probably ministered to half the men in the unit. So think of that's why it's important to research the unit, because if you think about it, it's a family affair in a way. So definitely very important to research. So don't limit yourself to your direct ancestor. Obtain records of the brothers and uncles and cousins. Again, can provide very helpful information. Don't limit yourself to pension records. Even if you got a great pension, go look at those service records if you can still obtain them. Think about non-military aspects of the military records, civilians, and so on. And then internet. There's lots of websites out there, lots of resources. I couldn't even begin to, these are the ones you probably already know about, and some that we can get through the library here. So lots of resources out there. Lots of search engines. I'm a big Google person, but there's Bing, Yahoo, and various others. So it's a matter of knowing what kind of search terms to use. Civil War in quotes, things like that, Revolutionary War. Maybe the name of the unit, 60th Georgia Regiment in quotes. When you're researching the actual unit history, companies, battalions, cavalry, research the commander, the colonel of the unit or whatever. That might help you, give you some more insight into the history of your ancestors' unit. I should update this because I think they just released, last year they released 100,000 more books that went into the public domain. Anything published before 1924 is in the public domain. And you have Internet Archive. Some of this stuff is on Family Search, but some of it's just out there in general. Google Books has a lot of digitized books out there. And again, books that were written in the 1850s, from our perspective, is probably far better than a book that was written in the 1950s about something 100 years earlier. So, lots of good books out there on Google Books, for example. Photos. People don't think about, what ship your ancestor served on. Get an old photo of that ship. Photo of the weapon, photo of, you might find a unit photo, a partial unit photo, a photo of the unit leader, things like that. And a lot more artwork is being done. Civil War art is a popular form of art for Civil War historians. Keyword searching again on the internet. These are basically similar if you're searching in a library catalog. These kinds of terminologies by, United States, specific state or county even. Unit histories, the ancestor. You put your ancestor in quotes, full name. or partial, sometimes like I'll do R.M. Wilbanks, since my great grandfather was Robert Martin Wilbanks Sr., but I might do R.M. Wilbanks. He appears in a lot on the internet, a lot that way. So you can try different ways of looking for your ancestor. So hopefully I've given you a good concept of the power of military records, the wealth of information. Again, don't limit yourself to just your direct ancestor. Don't limit yourself to the pension records. Look for what other possibilities might be out there. So take more time to learn about your ancestor and their experience in the war. So have fun, good luck. Thank you. Yes.
Census have a 72-year waiting period. Do military records, because I have a deceased brother-in-law who served in the 1960s.
Yeah, that's where I was talking about individual service records are slowly, like I said, World War I is starting to be transitioned over to general open access. World War II is also starting to be transitioned over. Definitely Korea, Vietnam, that's not, the 72-year will still apply. But what they are releasing are various kinds of reports that were done by the military. So I have seen World War II, Korean reports of all veterans killed in action for Korea. It's just a listing of, so those are starting to show up on sites like Fold3, Family Search, and so on. But as far as trying to get a full individual service record, probably not yet.
Have you brought any books that you published?
Nope, sorry, no books today. I got to get back into that. I did publish a book. I've been wanting to do a second edition, but I haven't been able to get to it.
I can't read my notes sometimes when they get close.
Well, like I said, yeah, so the handouts should be online. This has been recorded. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, you know what? People are always asking me about that. I mean, because it's military but non-military, but military associated. So I would say that it probably exists as some aspect of military records. I just don't know how to research that. It's probably something at the National Archives. I just don't know. Yeah.
Can I make a plug? Are there any veterans here today?
Stand up, please. Thank you.